thank you all for having me here. I am not a Solidarity member, yet, parentheses, but I've been really happy to work alongside Soli members over, my time in activism over the last, decade or two. I want to apologise. I had started drafting something, and then I only realised at 4:55 today that the invite that I got to speak on the 28th was actually for the 27th, which is why I've just had to dash here. It's okay. So I just had to dash here from a union meeting, which very conveniently was taking place at Trades Hall, which is 15 minutes walk away, or 10 if you're gay. And so I managed to get here on time, and it was quite good because we managed to get past a motion registering the region's condemnation of the state government's appalling our crime adult time stuff, lifted straight from the Queensland LNP's handbook, so we can hopefully get a bit more pressure built up against that. And I guess building pressure sounds like a good launching off point for this, because I think for parties like the Greens, which exist in a space that is very much definitively to the left of the ALP, very much definitively towards the centre of a lot of more extra-parliamentary left groups. I think that a lot of... I don't imagine I'd be going out on too much of a limb here to imagine that most people who've been involved in the group like Solidarity have at points, scoffed at the Greens giving in to the liberalism of bourgeois democracy, and at points I have joined you in that scoffing. And so the question then becomes, well, what's the point of doing something like that? And I think that the global excitement over something like what our boy Young Cardamom, what Zohran Mamdani did over in New York City is a good launching off point to kind of frame that and to think about that. What we saw was something that was presented by the media as if it had come out of nowhere, but which everyone who was clued into what the democratic socialist movement in the United States has been up to, particularly over the last 9 or 10 years since the Burnett challenge in 2016 really gave it a shot in the arm and a lot more publicity than it had had prior to that, and saw a lot more people joining who had not been actively involved prior to that. Leading up to this groundswell that was able to challenge and to win. And that's important for a few reasons. The first and most obvious of that is hope. We on the left have been taking consistent L's since, give or take, 1979, right? There have been some points that we have pushed back against that, and there have been some wins that we've been able to take real pride in. But broadly, since the introduction of the neoliberal order and since the globalisation of that, it has become increasingly hard for us on the left to scrape back wins against the global right-wing hegemon. And it becomes very easy to fall into doomerism, to fall into the trap of thinking, well, we can't win, and so why fight? I have seen this happen to many a comrade of mine temporarily, and even some in a more permanent way where they've just checked out of everything. I'm sure that it's happened to many of your friends, and it may have for a time, happened to you when you're just absolutely sick of how things are going, how you can work and put everything into it and still not see runs on the board. It's so disheartening. And so I think finding wins, no matter how big an asterisk you've got to put next to that win, finding wins to hold onto can be incredibly important just for maintaining the ability to keep fighting. And I think that for people in New York, for people across the United States, and for people across the Western world, and particularly the Anglosphere, where we find ourselves so culturally dominated by the United States, that can be valuable because most of the news that comes to us from outside of the United States falls into the doomer category, right? It's also the question of why put that effort in at an electoral level. And I think the subtitle to that question, implicit or at points explicit, is almost every time when we have seen someone left-wing get elected on a strong left-wing platform, we have seen them back down from that platform. We are already seeing some, fairly justified criticisms of Mamdani, who, along with a lot of very good people in his transition team, who come from the trade union movement, who come from tenant organising, who come from democratic socialist organising groups, he's also held on to a right-wing police commissioner rather than sacking him before it can get started. And a lot of people are like, cool, we can just give up on Mamdani already in the comments, or people being like, actually this means nothing. We all know that there's way more nuance in there than that. But we think about where Mamdani is starting from. For him to backslide rightwards still puts him to the left of pretty much everyone else going. And this is after a similar thing happened with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the same part of the US, where she's backslid probably much faster than most people were bracing for her to, or Sanders himself, particularly on the Zionism issue. But I think that counterintuitively, that's not a reason to not get involved. I think that it provides for a reason to instead kind of keep pushing, keep on dragging that Overton window back towards the left, back towards what we would have considered the centre-right a couple of decades ago, if we're being completely honest with ourselves. And if we surrender that space to the right, or worse still, to a combination of the right and the liberal centrist so-called left, then it really just makes it easier for them to keep pushing. This is what we certainly notice here in Australia at points where it really is just the ALP, LNP duopoly that have the bulk of the power. When there's not a check on the ALP coming from the left, it makes it so much easier for them to keep going. All right? And the fact is that a place like, I don't remember the name of it, but the Mayor's House in New York, a place like Congress, a place like Canberra, a place like Spring Street, it's full of brainwaves, folks. It is a place that has its own logic, that has its own set of understandings, that has its own norms, because when you're in there, almost everybody you are talking to is either another parliamentarian, almost all of whom are far to your right, if you are coming from a half-decent standing point. The press gallery, who we pretend are still relevant, even though ain't nobody listening to commercial radio, ain't nobody buying newspapers, certainly not buying The Australian, but who, we give that power to as thought leaders simply by believing that they have that power on some old god shit. Professional senior public servants on six-figure salaries. Where most people are coming from when they go into there is thinking, okay, yeah, things are going great, the status quo might need some tweaking. Most politicians on the left, some of the more radical people of the ALP who haven't been involved long enough to realise just how anti-democratic that institution is, some independents, I would say a fair few of the Greens, are coming in from a position of, we want to change things, but not being kind of braced against that. The most that someone can do, what we see from people who, really stand heavily against it in Australia, the examples that I always tend to go for are Lydia Thorpe and Max Chandler-Mather, ones who are aware of those going in, and that gives them at least the ability to brace against it. I think that, and at the risk of being accused of doomerism myself, I think that there is a sense of inevitability to the internal logic of such a place taking over and wearing you down and getting you to accept the logic of a right-wing institution like Spring Street, like Parliament up in Canberra, like Congress or the Mayor's office over in New York City. But by being aware of it and willing to fight against it, you can last a lot longer than most, which is why, institutional powers that be work so hard to crush those two, right? We saw Lydia putting up with the most vile attacks constantly. We saw her turned on by the right wing of the Greens, sadly successfully, against the wishes of a fair few members. We saw Max get targeted constantly. He has referred to, in a podcast recorded since he lost his seat, he referred to Parliament as the mental illness factory, which should give you an impression of how good his 3 years there went. And so having that happen to you means that only by being the most aware of it and against it can you even hope to stand a chance. And even then, the full weight of the institution will come to bear on someone who has, pointed out the fact the emperor looks like they're dressed for a German beach. Okay? And so that's where the rest of us come in. That's where, in the absence of civil society, in a way that made sense in the 20th century, in the absence of a radical trade union movement until we can wrest back control from the careerist ALP heads, it comes down to those of us who are involved in our local parties, whether that's the Greens or Victorian Socialists or Socialist Alliance, those of us involved in organised left-wing groups like Solidarity, being able to put and maintain that pressure, because it helps to keep the people who are trying, the tiny, tiny minority who are trying to do the right thing, it helps keep them rooted, it helps keep them sane, it helps keep them in touch with why they went there and what people are actually going for. I talked a lot with people during my campaign who were just like, oh, how come you're out here on the doors with the rest of us instead of off doing photo shoots or whatever? It's because it's a campaign. It's not me. I'm just the candidate, right? A cricket team is not its wicket keeper. A football team is not its captain. It's a pivotal position, yes, but it's one that is part of a greater whole, and it's only by maintaining that connection with the greater whole. We talk a lot in the left-wing tendencies in the Greens about the purpose of door knocking is to talk and have persuasive conversations with voters, yes, but it's also political training for party volunteers and candidates, because it teaches you how regularised people think, and you forget if you just read the news or read social media algorithms or listen to the narrative pushed by the major parties, that most people hold positions that are to the left of the establishment duopoly on most things. But, hegemony, ideology, the brainworms of it all make it very hard to push past that. So as much as we are pushing from our end in helping chat to people, being like, hey, if we win, these things can be changed, it is not inevitable, it's also training for us in terms of, these are who I'm fighting for. This is what people actually believe, not what the press gallery tells me that they believe, what the person who I talked to the other day on a street in Reza told me that they believe, and that's more important. And so I think that's, from the perspective of kind of the intersection between where I'm coming from as someone who, came up through in social movements and is on the activist wing of the Greens, and groups who I see as very much aligned with our aims, if not our strategies, like Solidarity as being. It's in making sure that, whether or not we get someone elected who is coming from the right place, we make sure that there is the pressure there to, if they are coming from the right place, they keep being reminded of where they've come from, and they know that there is the support to keep on standing up for those principled things that got in there. And if they're not, then they're scared for the next 3 years.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much, Tara, for that introduction. I suppose I just wanted to take a step back a little and just register really the extraordinary political development that Mamdani's win actually represents. And we haven't really gone over that, but I think it's important for us to situate that. He's someone who has openly described himself as a socialist, a democratic socialist, with aspirations for working class people in a city dominated by Wall Street. This is not nothing. This is very, very significant, and we really need to register this. He ran on a program of taxing the rich very explicitly to make New York City more affordable on housing by freezing rents, reducing the cost of childcare and groceries. On top of that, Mamdani, in the face of severe Islamophobic attacks, was unapologetic about his Muslim identity, particularly in the context of 9/11. Like, he really did crystallise, I think, for a generation of Muslims who lived in that period. The racism and the Islamophobia, that really became part of an official state ideology with the commencement of the US Empire's invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. Mamdani was also, very importantly, a supporter, very vocal supporter of Palestine. He campaigned explicitly about, if Netanyahu shows up in New York City, Netanyahu will be arrested as part of the warrant that's been issued by the ICC, and obviously has a background, participating in campaigns to disarm Israel in the US. He was also very explicit in confronting Trump's anti-immigrant racism, and right now the raids that ICE has been launching across the US, but also in New York, is something that there's been a lot of opposition about. So it's very important, I think, that we recognise this is very, very significant in terms of what's happened. He won around 1 million votes, which is about 50% of the electorate, which shows you the incredible breadth of support that he does have for this program of taxing the rich and funding programs for working class people. This was also in the face of thousands and thousands of dollars by tech billionaires like Elon Musk, who had, thrown money for Trump's campaign when Trump was during elected, to the Mamdani's rivals, Andrew Cuomo and Silwin from the Democrats. In the face of all of that, the message that of taxing the rich, of standing against oppression, won, and I think that's very, very important for us. And I'm going to go through now a little bit of the lessons I think that we can take from this victory to make them more explicit, and also talk about some of the challenges. I think the first thing, and I think Tara has noted this as well, it's very important. It's given a very big boost of confidence that the left can beat Trump. If you think back to the period when Trump was elected, there was an incredible amount of fear. The positions that people were taking on the left were positions of, for some people, capitulation. We can't fight. We should just hand things over. Try and keep a little bit over here. But actually, there was really no confidence to do that. And there was a lot of fear, particularly around transphobia and racism. And I think what's very important to register is actually Mamdani has been able to win part of Trump's base back. That's an important lesson for the left. It's not about saying that the people who voted Trump were just, they're just part of the problem. Actually, what Mamdani, sort of basically acknowledged this. 1 out of 10 Trump voters actually now voted for him and the DSA. So I think that's a very important lesson. A second one, I think, is about the centrality of class politics. He was very, very explicit about the pervasive deepening of class inequality in the US and in New York City in particular. And it's actually, it's extraordinary to think about the situation that working class people are in the US. There's been a massive transfer in terms of wealth under the auspices of neoliberal economic policy for the last 40 years. You're talking about, policies that are about free markets, a tax on organised labour, and a politics of rampant individualism instead of collective struggle. The deterioration of economic and social conditions has been pushed by the Democrats. You can talk about Bill Clinton, as well as the Republicans, such as Bush, going right through, to Obama as well, and Trump in his first term. Some of these statistics I always think it's good to be reminded of in terms of America. America is now one of the most unequal societies in the entire world. If you think, you need some statistics to understand this. 20% of the wealth flows to the top 1% in the US. The top 0.1% in America holds 90% of the wealth of the bottom 90% of society. That's extraordinary levels of economic inequality. So you can see that Mamdani's campaign about taxing the rich was very important, because it was about responding to the economic devastation as well as the social devastation that people have seen in the US. If you look at suicide rates, you can look at drug addiction, you can look at the culture of violence. the American society has been in a period of serious decay. And I think that's what's very important, is the left is actually responding to this, and there's some political space about an alternative agenda to responding to this that's not coming from the right. Very important as well, I think, in terms of the lesson of Mamdani, is about standing with the oppressed, and raising politics, and not actually just this idea, we sort of talk about it as rank economism, which is about simply just talking about bread and butter and economic issues. And I think it's very important right now in the US that the left offered an alternative vision to this and took up these attacks. If you think about the attacks on trans people, they've been ruthlessly targeted under Trump's regime. As I mentioned before, the raids by ICE on immigrants, the fact that he named the genocide in Palestine, standing up to Islamophobia, all of these things were very central actually about his win. And I don't want to gloss over those. I actually want to dwell on those because I don't know if other people followed his campaign, but my feed was flooded with these things, and I was actually very moved by them. I'm sure a lot of people were. He delivered messages that really did reflect, I think, the multiracial and sexual and gender diverse reality of the working class. He talked about, he delivered his messages in Arabic language. I don't know if there are many Arabic speakers here, but many Arabic speakers thought they were, he was quite good at, in the way he was able to connect with people about that. He made stories about Stonewall and the history of the struggle of queer people for liberation in New York City. He also talked at various events about, there's one particular thing I saw about him talking to a community of Haitians, and he was, saying to them, actually, it's really great, the lesson that you've actually given us in the United States, and that is the lesson of the Haitian Revolution and how people actually stood up and smashed slavery to pieces. And I think these things really showed you this wasn't someone who was just rolling out some sort of diversity card, but actually had a really deep sense of the histories and struggles of oppressed people. And I think that was very central, I think, in terms of him communicating that as part of standing up to that, standing up to the right and standing up to Trump. As I mentioned sort of before, we have, our own sort of theory about this tradition. It's, referred to as the Tribune of the Press, and I think that's a very important thing. And it's it's a debate that's happening across the world right now. If you look at in the UK, right, there's a big debate about the rise of reform. And whether the left and your party, which is being talked about with Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana, and whether they should be taking up the issues of trans oppression, whether they should be taking up political questions. And I think that's an important lesson from Mamdani's campaign, is that absolutely you have to. You cannot win unless you actually take those politics on. So just to talk a little bit now about the challenges. Mamdani's electoral victory, it's been noted, across the place, is going to face and is already facing significant opposition on a range of levels. At the federal level, you have Trump, who, while the campaign was going, was talking about withdrawing funds to create basically an economic crisis in New York City. That's one thing. There's also the state level, where actually Mamdani and the DSA don't control the state budget. The governor actually controls the state budget, is, part of the Democratic Party. There's also the very fact that even people would have seen the much sort of anticipated press conference with Trump recently. In the week leading up to that, in the House, there was actually a vote about decrying the horrors of socialism in the House. And 86 Republicans actually voted for, Democrats actually voted for that. So you can see in the Democratic Party, there's a lot of hostility in and of itself to the messages of taxing the rich and socialism that Mamdani represents. But on top of that, as I mentioned, and I think it is important, and Tara mentioned this as well, the pressures that are on Mamdani have already had an impact. You can see the fact that keeping with Tish, the New York PD, as the chief police She is an arch-Zionist. She is a millionaire. She's a friend of Trump, and Mamdani, caved to those pressures and kept her on, which is something we have to register. It's not a good sign. On top of that, I think you can also see the press conference. Now, people would have watched that, and it's generated a whole lot of different opinions. But I think it's, there's two things going on. There's a lot of things going on. But the two things, I think we can distill from it that I think are important to take away are that on the one hand, you have Trump very obviously trying to co-opt Mamdani in terms of, what he represents, the fact that actually he has taken some of Trump's base. Trump is actually in a weak position. He's fallen in terms of his popularity. He's not what he was when he first took power. But on top of that, I think you can also see Mamdani, unfortunately, all too willing, I think, to accommodate in that press conference. There were many opportunities, I think, for him to differentiate, some of the messages. And he did talk about, the genocide in Palestine, and he did raise some good things, but there are a lot of things where I think he was, very willing to accommodate. And I think there's another factor as well. So Hakeem Jeffries, I don't know if people know, so Mamdani is supporting effectively his election or maintaining his position against a left-wing candidate from the DSA because of basically a political arithmetic about having enough people in the state legislature so they can get the numbers to do things rather than actually taking a principled stand and supporting the left-wing candidate in that candidacy. So I think all of these things are very concerning signs. But I think what we need to take away from that is that it's not actually about the election of Mamdani himself that's going to be able to deliver the change. It's actually about the social movements outside that are capable of making that change. And actually, it's part of why Mamdani is also in power. There's no way the message about Palestine would have cut through without what we've seen with, years-long protests about genocide and the campaign on campuses about Palestine. Same thing, in terms of Black Lives Matter. These social movements actually really shook American capitalism, and I think it's important for us to understand that that's actually where the power lies. And I think, there's a great abolitionist and ex-slave, Frederick Douglass, who said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And I think that's the important thing, in tradition we have to look to. It is actually the demand and the social movements and the power in the working class and the unions that can deliver that change. And actually we also saw some signs of that with Trump's first administration with strikes by Boeing and other dockers. And I think that's the power that we're going to have to look to, whether it's, in the US or also thinking about here in Australia, in terms of making any, significant change. It's not going to come from, dealing and wheeling in the Parliament. But I think it is also important to understand that the dynamics that we're seeing in the US are dynamics that are also having an impact here in Australia. So, Albanese was in the US, and instead of reaching out to Mamdani, having anything to say about Mamdani, wanted to ingratiate himself with Trump. That's who the Labor government is looking to, and I think that's very, very explicit in terms of it creating a disillusionment with Labor in terms of what Labor stands for. And it's important, I think, for us to understand that disillusionment with Labor, there's no automatic thing about it going to the left. Similarly, there's no automatic thing about it going to the right. And at the moment, the right is actually benefiting from this. Hanson's vote is up. It's about 9 points shy of the Liberals. And I think it's very important for us to recognise without that kind of perspective of looking to the struggle in the streets, looking into the workplaces, that's the way that disillusionment can be pulled to the left.